My name is Lakota Denton, and I'm a personal injury lawyer in Asheville, North Carolina. A lot of people come and ask me what their personal injury case is worth. And the reason they're asking what it's worth is because under North Carolina law, if you cause somebody else to be injured through your negligence or usually through crashing into them with your car, you have to pay for their injuries. And so people want to know what their case is worth because the law says they are entitled to compensation for their injuries. And what that means is that the law says you're entitled to payment for medical bills that you've incurred, for lost wages you might have had as a result of your injury, and for something called pain and suffering. And pain and suffering is the law's way of saying people ought to be compensated for having gone through the injury they've gone through no fault of their own. Now, the value of a personal injury case is based on many, many factors. I want to go through a list of the most important factors, but keep in mind that there are hundreds or even thousands of different variables in any personal injury case that can affect the value of the case. And also keep in mind that the value of the case is different if you settle the case before you file a lawsuit, if you settle the case in a mediation after you file a lawsuit, or if you are asking a jury to compensate you for your injuries. All of those have different values based on where you are in your case. Now, the most important thing affecting the value of your case is the severity of your injury. You can imagine that somebody with a neck strain has a much lower case value than someone who has broken a leg. If someone has gone through surgery or multiple surgeries, then the value of their case is worth a lot more than someone who simply has a neck strain and goes to the hospital just once and then goes home and they get better after a couple weeks. So the severity of the injury has a huge impact on the value of the case. And when I say the value of the case, what I really mean is how an insurance company would look at the case and how a jury would look at the case. And juries, particularly in North Carolina, don't give a lot of money for compensation for somebody with a mild, minor injury. Now, another factor that affects the value of your case is how the injury actually occurred. If you take an example of a car crash, if you're hit from behind and there's very little damage to your car and very little damage to the car that hit you, and you've been injured, it's going to be difficult to argue that the case has a lot of value in front of a jury if there's very little damage to your car. On the other hand, I've represented people who have been hit from behind or hit from the side in their vehicle, causing their vehicle to actually roll over or go off the road and land in a ditch, or totaling their vehicle where the damage is so bad to their vehicle that they can't even fix it. So the severity of how the injury occurred is significant, and it affects the value of the case. Another factor, particularly for insurance companies, is the amount of your medical bills. Insurance companies like to look at the amount of your medical bills and try to gauge how much a jury would award based on that number. So you can imagine that if a jury is presented with a case with $2,500 in medical bills, they're probably not going to award very much money to your case for your pain and suffering, because usually if your medical bills are that low, then your injury is not that severe. On the other hand, I've handled cases where the medical bills are over $100,000. You can imagine if you have over $100,000 in medical bills, you've probably had a pretty serious injury, pretty substantial injury. And insurance companies and juries will put more value on a case that has a high amount of medical bills. Now, another factor that most people don't think about that affects the value of your case is the behavior of the person that caused your injury. For example, if someone crashes into you in your vehicle and they cause your injury, well, why did they crash into you? What were they doing? And what kind of a record do they have? So if someone crashes into you and it's a sweet sweet grandmother, and she apologizes, and she's never had a speeding ticket, and she's never been in a crash, and she feels terrible about bumping into you, well, that doesn't really change the value of the case very much. But if a person crashes into you who has been drinking and driving, and their blood alcohol limit is above the legal limit, and maybe they've been involved in 2 or 3 crashes in the last year, maybe they've been convicted of a felony in the last 5 or 7 years, well, then the value of the case is increased, because it's likely that an insurance company or a jury are going to be more likely to compensate you if the defendant has done something really egregious. Now, another factor to consider, and this relates to the severity of your injury, is whether or not your injury is permanent. So if you are injured, and let's say you have a back sprain, and it lasts 2, 3, or 4 months, and you get chiropractic treatment or physical therapy, and then after 2 or 3 or 4 months, it's mostly better, it's manageable, and it's getting better, and you're back to normal. Well, that case doesn't have the value of a case where you sustained a permanent injury. So if you have the same back injury, but it takes years to get treatment, and after all the treatment you can do, your doctor says, this is as good as your back is going to be. And you've lost 25% use to your back, or 10% use to your back, and it's always, for the rest of your life, it's going to be somewhat limited. Well, that's a permanent injury as a result of somebody else's negligence, and the case is more valuable. And that goes back to what we talked about with pain and suffering. A jury and an insurance company are going to put money on that case for future pain and suffering, for having to live with that injury for the rest of your life. Finally, an important piece of this is how much insurance coverage is available on a case, and that affects the value of the case. In North Carolina, drivers are only required to carry $30,000 in automobile insurance. So if you have $40,000 in medical bills from a really bad car crash, and the person that caused the crash only has $30,000 in coverage, well, the case is worth $30,000 and no more. Now, there are other ways to find other insurance policies, which get a little bit complicated, but keep in mind that the amount of insurance coverage available will affect how much money you can recover from a personal injury. The last factor I want to talk about is you. And you are going to present your personal injury claim to either an insurance company or to a jury. Your case is worth more if you can present your case well, if you are likable, if you are articulate, if you are honest, if you are truthful, if the jury perceives you as having a legitimate injury and not overreaching. I always tell people who are going to testify that it is not your job to complain about what happened or to be angry about what happened. Your job is just to tell us what happened in the simplest terms possible. So you can affect the value of your case by making yourself a good witness. Now, there are some online formulas that I've seen that try to tell people the value of their case. And a lot of the formulas simply base that on the amount of your medical bills. I've had clients come to me and say, my case is worth this much, and I went online and I filled out this formula and it told me that my case is worth this much money. And I asked them how they reached that number, and they said, well, they multiplied my medical bills times 3, and that's the value of my case. Those formulas are very inaccurate, and they simply don't take into account enough of the different factors that affect the value of your case. And I'll give you an example. I had a client who was in a car crash and suffered permanent vertigo as part of a concussion. And she was going to have to live with this vertigo probably for the rest of her life. Now, her medical bills were only $15,000 because you don't perform surgery for that kind of condition. The treatment is conservative. There's physical therapy, an injection or two to try and help. But with only $15,000 in medical bills, this formula, if she went online, would have told her maybe her case is worth $45,000. In reality, the case is worth a lot more because she had a permanent injury. Now, another example would be if somebody's in a crash and it's a really bad crash, but they don't appear that hurt. They go to the emergency room, and out of caution, the emergency room runs an MRI, a CT scan, multiple x-rays, and all this testing is really expensive. And so I have folks that could have $20,000 in medical bills just from tests, and they're uninjured. They go to the emergency room, they get all these tests done, and then they walk out and they don't follow up with any kind of treatment because they're mostly fine. So that person would have $20,000 in medical bills. Well, that case is not worth $60,000 just because they have $20,000 in medical bills. So don't use the formulas online. They're not accurate. They don't take into account all of the factors that you need to know. It's more important to talk to a personal injury lawyer and ask them their opinion. I don't charge anything to talk to people about their case. I often talk to people and tell them you don't need a lawyer. So most lawyers won't charge you anything. Ask them what you think the value of the case is. Of course, the person who's going to know the most about what the value of your case is a lawyer who handles these things every single day. Now, if you have any questions, please contact me. I'd be happy to speak with you about your case. And thanks for listening.